On July 7, 1968, Harlem slowed to a standstill. Traffic paused. Storefronts emptied. Windows opened. An estimated 5,000 people gathered, not for a politician, not for a celebrity, but for a man most of America only knew as a criminal. His name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And even in death, he sent a message that the Mafia and New York understood clearly. This is the real story of Bumpy Johnson's final chapter. The man he became. The rules he lived by. The enemies who learned to respect him. And why thousands came to honor him when he was gone. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the world as Bumpy Johnson, was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, at a time when the rules of American life were rigidly divided by race. His childhood was shaped by poverty, violence, and the early realization that authority rarely protected people who looked like him. The nickname Bumpy came from a small bump on his head, but it would eventually become one of the most recognizable names in Harlem's underworld. When Johnson moved north to Harlem as a young man, he arrived during a period of transition. Harlem was alive with culture, music, and ambition, yet beneath the surface it was tightly controlled by organized crime groups that saw the neighborhood as a profitable territory rather than a community. Illegal gambling, numbers rackets, and bootlegging were dominated by outsiders, while local residents were often excluded from real power. Bumpy Johnson stood out almost immediately not because of brute force, but because of how he carried himself. He was known to dress sharply, speak calmly, and choose his words carefully. Unlike many of his peers, he was deeply interested in literature and history. He read Shakespeare, debated philosophy, and quoted poetry. This combination of intellect and street awareness made him unpredictable to enemies and compelling to allies. Johnson's reputation grew as someone who could navigate both violence and negotiation. He understood when force was necessary, but he also recognized the long-term cost of chaos. Where others ruled through fear alone, Bumpy relied on structure, consistency, and reputation. He punished betrayal harshly, but he also rewarded loyalty generously. To Harlem residents, he became something complicated. He was undeniably a criminal, yet he was also a man who understood the neighborhood's struggles because he lived them. He was seen helping families, intervening in disputes, and protecting local interests when institutions failed to do so. By the time Bumpy Johnson reached the height of his influence, he was no longer just an enforcer or a racketeer. He had become a symbol of resistance, of control, and of a man who refused to let Harlem be managed without representation. Understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was requires accepting contradiction. He was intelligent and ruthless, thoughtful and dangerous, disciplined and violent. And it was precisely this balance that allowed him to survive in a world where most men did not. By the time Bumpy Johnson rose to prominence in Harlem, New York City's criminal underworld was already firmly structured. The Italian Mafia controlled most of the city's major rackets, gambling, loan sharking, bootlegging, and later narcotics. Their power came from organization, political influence, and a willingness to use overwhelming violence. For smaller operators, the choice was usually simple: submit, cooperate, or disappear. Harlem, however, was different. The neighborhood was densely populated, tightly knit, and culturally unified in ways other parts of the city were not. Outsiders could operate there, but only with difficulty. Information moved quickly. Strangers were noticed. Heavy-handed violence attracted attention that disrupted business. The Mafia understood the profits Harlem offered, but they also recognized the risks. This is where Bumpy Johnson became indispensable. Rather than confronting the Mafia directly, Johnson positioned himself as an intermediary, someone who could maintain order inside Harlem while ensuring that business interests remained protected. He didn't beg for permission, and he didn't posture. He negotiated from a position of necessity. Harlem needed internal control, and the Mafia needed stability. The arrangement that followed was never written down, never formally announced, and never openly discussed. But it was understood. Bumpy Johnson would run Harlem's internal operations, and in return, the Mafia would allow him autonomy as long as money flowed and chaos stayed contained. This uneasy truce was built on mutual respect rather than trust. The Mafia did not see Bumpy as an equal in status, but they recognized his value. Attempts to replace him would likely spark resistance, violence, and lost revenue. Johnson, for his part, knew the limits of his position. He avoided unnecessary provocation and kept disputes local whenever possible. What made this relationship unusual was Bumpy Johnson's refusal to become a mere front man. He protected Harlem operators from exploitation, insisted on fair terms, and enforced discipline within his territory. He understood that control wasn't about intimidation alone, it was about predictability. Over time, this arrangement allowed Harlem to function with relative stability compared to other neighborhoods. Violence still existed, but it was controlled. Business continued without constant disruption. For the Mafia, this was profitable. For Harlem, it meant having someone who answered to the neighborhood before answering to outsiders. The truce held not because it was friendly, but because it was functional. And in the criminal world, function often matters more than loyalty. Bumpy Johnson's rise was never uninterrupted. Like many figures who operated in organized crime, his power was repeatedly tested by the justice system. Arrests, convictions, and long prison sentences were part of his life, not exceptions. At one point, he spent nearly a decade behind bars during what should have been the most active years of his career. For most men in the underworld, prison meant irrelevance. Networks dissolved, loyalties shifted, and territories were absorbed by rivals. But Bumpy Johnson's influence did not disappear, it paused. From inside prison, Johnson maintained correspondence, studied law, and kept his mind sharp. He read extensively, particularly philosophy and literature, and became known among inmates as someone who debated ideas as easily as he defended himself. This intellectual discipline mattered. When he eventually returned to Harlem, he was not reckless or desperate. He was focused. His return was not marked by violent retribution or dramatic takeovers. Instead, it was calm and deliberate. People noticed. Rivals waited. The Mafia watched closely. What they saw was a man who understood timing better than force. Johnson had changed. He was older, more patient, and less interested in constant confrontation. He understood that survival depended on restraint as much as dominance. Rather than expanding aggressively, he focused on restoring balance, reasserting authority quietly, rebuilding trust, and stabilizing operations that had become fragmented during his absence. Importantly, Harlem residents welcomed him back. That reception wasn't guaranteed. Years away could have weakened his standing, but many people remembered the order he maintained and the way disputes were handled under his leadership. To them, Bumpy Johnson represented continuity in a neighborhood where change often arrived through disruption. His relationship with the Mafia also evolved. They saw a man who had endured prison without breaking, returned without chaos, and continued to deliver stability. That endurance reinforced their respect. In the criminal world, longevity itself is proof of competence. This phase of Bumpy Johnson's life marked a transition. He was no longer merely a rising figure proving himself. He had become an institution, someone whose presence shaped the environment around him. Violence was still part of his world, but it was no longer his primary language. Prison had not softened him, but it had sharpened him. It taught him that power was temporary, reputation was permanent, and survival required adaptation. This evolution would define the final chapters of his life and ultimately, his legacy. By the early 1960s, Harlem was no longer the neighborhood Bumpy Johnson had first come to dominate. The cultural energy was still there, but the social and political climate had shifted dramatically. Civil rights struggles were intensifying, distrust between communities and law enforcement was deepening, and economic pressure was growing. Violence, both organized and spontaneous, was becoming more unpredictable. Bumpy Johnson was now in his late 50s and early 60s, an age few men in his line of work ever reached. His reputation remained strong, but his approach had clearly changed. He was less visible, more selective, and far more cautious. Where younger figures rushed to assert dominance, Johnson preferred to observe, intervene only when necessary, and allow smaller conflicts to resolve themselves. This restraint was deliberate. Johnson understood that Harlem was fragile. Heavy-handed enforcement, whether by criminals or police, only escalated tensions. He discouraged unnecessary violence within his sphere of influence and focused on maintaining stability. This did not make him passive. When lines were crossed, responses were swift and unmistakable. But chaos for its own sake had no place in his thinking. His relationship with the community during these years became more complex. To some, he was still a dangerous criminal figure from an older era. To others, he was a stabilizing presence, someone who understood the street better than any official and acted when systems failed. Stories circulated of quiet assistance, rent paid, disputes settled, families protected from predatory forces. Johnson also kept his distance from political movements. He did not publicly align himself with activists or organizations, understanding that visibility brought scrutiny and risk. Yet he was deeply aware of the changes happening around him. The assassinations of prominent leaders, the growing anger among young people, and the pressure on Harlem's identity did not escape him. The Mafia, too, adjusted their approach. Bumpy Johnson was no longer someone to challenge or replace. He was tolerated, even valued, because he prevented instability that could threaten profits. His age and experience made him predictable, and predictability was valuable. In these final years, Johnson was less concerned with expanding influence and more focused on preserving order. He had seen too many empires collapse through excess and arrogance. What mattered now was leaving Harlem intact, even if his own role within it would eventually fade. He was preparing, consciously or not, for the end of his story. On the morning of July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson followed a routine that felt almost symbolic in its simplicity. He walked into Wells' restaurant, a familiar spot in Harlem where he often ate breakfast. There were no bodyguards hovering close, no visible tension, no sense that this day would be different from any other. For a man who had survived decades of violence, imprisonment, and threats, the moment was quiet, almost ordinary. Then, without warning, Bumpy Johnson collapsed. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing to be done. He was pronounced dead shortly after, the cause officially listed as a heart attack. He was 62 years old. The absence of violence surrounding his death surprised many people, but in another sense, it didn't. Johnson had outlived most of his contemporaries precisely because he avoided unnecessary confrontation. He had reached an age where enemies often fade, and respect replaces rivalry. There was no proven conspiracy, no confirmed assassination, no dramatic final showdown. Yet the shock came not from how he died, but from who he was when he died. News traveled quickly through Harlem. Word moved faster than newspapers, passed from storefronts to stoops, from barbershops to apartment windows. Bumpy Johnson was gone. For some, it felt like the end of an era. For others, it raised an uncomfortable question: what happens now? The Mafia reacted with silence. No statements. No visible presence. In their world, silence often signaled acknowledgement. They understood what Johnson's survival and now his death represented. He had held Harlem together in a way no outsider ever could. Law enforcement officials viewed his death with mixed emotions. Some saw it as the quiet conclusion to a criminal career. Others recognized that Johnson's presence had ironically reduced chaos. His passing created uncertainty, not relief. For Harlem residents, reactions were deeply personal. Many remembered him not as a legend, but as a familiar figure, someone they had seen, spoken to, or quietly relied upon. His death felt sudden not because it was violent, but because it left a void no one was prepared to fill. Bumpy Johnson did not die as he lived amid conflict, but his death marked a turning point. It ended a long, controlled balance between power, community, and survival. And within hours, it became clear that the true impact of his life would be measured not by how he died, but by what followed. In the days following Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem began preparing for something few expected at such a scale. Word spread quietly but steadily: people were coming to pay their respects. Not because they were told to. Not because they were afraid. But because they felt compelled to be there. On the day of the funeral, the streets surrounding the service filled early. By the time it began, an estimated 5,000 people had gathered. The crowd included longtime Harlem residents, small business owners, neighborhood elders, and men who kept their distance from public attention. Some stood silently. Others whispered stories. Many simply watched. The size of the turnout was impossible to ignore. Funerals in the criminal world are often small and guarded, attended only by close associates. This was different. This was public, visible, and unmistakably communal. It told a story without a single word being spoken. There were no speeches celebrating crime. No glorification of violence. The tone was restrained, almost solemn. What people were honoring wasn't just power, it was presence. Bumpy Johnson had been a constant in Harlem for decades. He had enforced rules, settled disputes, and maintained a kind of order when official systems failed or arrived too late. Law enforcement watched carefully. They noted the numbers, the calm, the lack of incident. A crowd this large could have turned volatile. It didn't. That alone spoke volumes about the control Johnson still exercised even in death. The Mafia did not appear publicly. No representatives were identified. No gestures were made. But their absence was not indifference. In organized crime, acknowledgement is often silent. They understood what this gathering represented, a man who had commanded loyalty beyond fear. For Harlem, the funeral was a moment of reflection. People didn't pretend Bumpy Johnson was innocent. They understood the complexity of who he was. But they also recognized that he had belonged to the neighborhood in a way few powerful figures ever did. The message sent that day was subtle but clear. Bumpy Johnson's authority had not come solely from violence or money. It had come from continuity, restraint, and understanding the community he operated within. 5,000 people didn't gather because they were afraid of him. They gathered because he mattered. Bumpy Johnson never delivered a dramatic final speech. There were no recorded statements, no public declarations, and no symbolic last words aimed at rivals or allies. Yet in many ways, his final message was louder than anything he could have said aloud. It was delivered through circumstance. The size and composition of his funeral conveyed a truth that the Mafia, law enforcement, and the city itself immediately understood. 5,000 people do not appear out of fear alone. Fear may silence opposition, but it rarely inspires presence. Respect, on the other hand, does. Bumpy Johnson's final message to the Mafia was not a challenge, it was a demonstration. It showed that his influence had extended beyond the mechanics of crime into something more difficult to control, loyalty rooted in familiarity and perceived fairness. That kind of influence cannot be bought or imposed from the outside. For the Mafia, this was significant. Their power relied on structure, hierarchy, and enforcement. What they saw at Johnson's funeral was a form of authority that existed independently of those systems. It was informal, organic, and deeply local. Removing Johnson had never been worth the risk precisely because what he represented could not easily be replaced. To Harlem residents, the message was different but equally clear. Johnson had been imperfect, but he had been consistent. He enforced rules when others exploited uncertainty. He intervened when violence threatened to spiral out of control. People knew where he stood, and that predictability mattered. The absence of chaos at the funeral was itself symbolic. No violence erupted. No confrontations occurred. The neighborhood held steady. That stability reflected Johnson's lasting imprint. Even in death, the systems he put in place continued to function, at least temporarily. This was his final statement: power doesn't have to announce itself to be real. In a city where authority often arrived with sirens and crackdowns, Johnson's influence had been quieter. He didn't seek headlines. He avoided unnecessary spectacle. He understood that the most durable form of control is the kind that blends into daily life. The Mafia saw that lesson clearly. They had always measured power in money and muscle. Johnson showed that legitimacy, even in an illegitimate world, was something else entirely. His final message was simple, unspoken, and unmistakable. You can dominate territory. You can intimidate rivals. But you cannot manufacture belonging. That had to be earned. After Bumpy Johnson's death, many outsiders assumed Harlem would quickly fall under tighter Mafia control. Historically, when a powerful figure disappeared, organized crime moved swiftly to absorb territory and revenue. But in Harlem, that didn't happen, at least not in the way many expected. The reason was simple: Bumpy Johnson hadn't ruled through force alone. He had acted as a stabilizing presence, a buffer between Harlem and external control. His authority was personal, rooted in long-standing relationships, local knowledge, and an understanding of how far pressure could be applied before it caused backlash. When he died, that balance vanished. The Mafia quickly realized that replacing Johnson wasn't a matter of appointing a new figurehead. Harlem did not respond well to outsiders attempting direct control. Without someone trusted locally, operations became fragmented. Smaller crews competed for influence. Disputes escalated faster. Violence became less predictable. From a business perspective, this instability was bad for profits. The Mafia thrived on order. They preferred quiet, controlled environments where money could move without disruption. Harlem after Johnson's death offered none of that. Attempts to assert control risked attracting attention from law enforcement and from the community itself. Law enforcement, meanwhile, noticed the shift. The absence of a central figure meant fewer negotiated resolutions and more chaotic incidents. Ironically, the removal of a powerful criminal figure made the neighborhood harder to police, not easier. The informal systems that had once kept conflicts contained were gone. For Harlem residents, the change was immediate. Without Johnson's oversight, there was no single authority to mediate disputes or enforce boundaries. Younger, more reckless figures emerged, often lacking the restraint Johnson had developed over decades. The result was increased tension and uncertainty. The Mafia understood this dynamic quickly. Rather than forcing dominance, they chose distance. Harlem became a place to engage carefully, indirectly, or not at all. Johnson had made himself indispensable by ensuring that his presence reduced risk for everyone involved, even his enemies. His death revealed a truth often overlooked in organized crime narratives: power built on local legitimacy cannot simply be inherited. It has to be cultivated over time, through consistency and understanding. The void Bumpy Johnson left behind was not empty, it was unstable. And for the Mafia, instability was far more dangerous than any one man had ever been. As the years passed after Bumpy Johnson's death, his name began to change shape. Stories grew larger. Details blurred. Some accounts portrayed him as a near-mythical protector of Harlem, while others reduced him to nothing more than a ruthless criminal. As with most figures who lived in the margins of history, the truth exists somewhere between those extremes. Bumpy Johnson did not fit neatly into any category. He was not a folk hero in the traditional sense. He did not fight the system to dismantle it, nor did he claim moral authority over the law. At the same time, he was not a mindless enforcer driven solely by violence. His actions were calculated, shaped by environment, survival, and a deep understanding of power dynamics. Popular culture has played a significant role in shaping his legend. Films, television series, and books often emphasize dramatic confrontations and violent episodes, because those moments are easier to tell. Quiet negotiations, restraint, and long-term stability are harder to dramatize. As a result, Johnson's patience and strategic thinking are sometimes overshadowed by his reputation for toughness. In reality, violence was a tool, not an identity. Johnson understood that excessive brutality attracted attention and destabilized business. He avoided it when possible and used it decisively when necessary. That balance is often lost in retellings that favor spectacle over context. Another misconception is that Bumpy Johnson operated as a solitary figure, independent of all external forces. In truth, he navigated constant pressure from the Mafia, from rivals within Harlem, and from law enforcement. His success came not from isolation, but from negotiation, compromise, and knowing when to stand firm. For Harlem residents who lived during his era, memories of Johnson vary widely. Some recall fear. Others recall protection. Many remember both. This duality is uncomfortable, but it is honest. Johnson's presence could bring order to one situation while reinforcing injustice in another. Understanding Bumpy Johnson requires rejecting simple narratives. He was neither a symbol of liberation nor a villain devoid of complexity. He was a man shaped by limited choices, operating in a system that rewarded control and punished weakness. The legend surrounding him tells us as much about society's fascination with power as it does about Johnson himself. The reality, quieter and more complicated, reveals why his story still invites debate long after the streets he once ruled moved on without him. Bumpy Johnson's death did not end his influence. Instead, it clarified it. Only after he was gone did the full weight of his role in Harlem become visible. The neighborhood he left behind was not suddenly liberated, nor was it immediately overrun. It became something more uncertain, a place without the informal structure that had quietly shaped daily life for decades. For law enforcement, Johnson's absence revealed a paradox. While he had been a known criminal figure, his presence had often limited chaos. Without him, conflicts escalated faster, disputes became harder to contain, and younger, less disciplined actors filled the vacuum. The idea that removing one powerful individual would automatically improve conditions proved overly simplistic. For the Mafia, the lesson was equally clear. Harlem was no longer a space that could be managed through indirect partnerships alone. Johnson had acted as a bridge, absorbing pressure, negotiating boundaries, and ensuring stability. Without him, the cost of involvement increased. The Mafia's reduced footprint in Harlem was not a moral decision, it was a strategic one. Within the community, Johnson's legacy remained complicated. He was remembered in fragments: a man who enforced order, a man who lived outside the law, a man who understood the neighborhood's unspoken rules. His story became a reference point in conversations about power, protection, and the absence of institutional trust. Culturally, Bumpy Johnson came to represent a broader question: what happens when communities rely on unofficial authority because official systems fail to protect them? His life exposed the space between legality and legitimacy, a space where many people lived, not by choice, but by necessity. Johnson did not leave behind a movement or a successor. He left behind a cautionary example. Power without accountability can become oppressive, but authority without connection collapses quickly. Johnson survived because he balanced those forces carefully, even imperfectly. Today, his name endures in books, documentaries, and debates, not because he was admirable in every way, but because he was effective. He demonstrated that influence is not measured solely by violence or wealth, but by how deeply one understands the environment they operate in. Bumpy Johnson's lasting impact lies not in myth or nostalgia, but in the uncomfortable lessons his life forces us to confront. He was neither a hero nor a monster. He was a product of his time and a mirror reflecting the failures and contradictions of the world around him. And that is why his story still matters.